So I will be doing a bit of a storytelling in the start and then going to the scientific part. So, we have, I said, from the scientist dilemma. So I want to start with this article that came, in Science in 2006. It was a full-page article on my work at that time. In fact, it was titled after the tsunami, The Scientist's Dilemma. So that's where the title of this talk comes from as well. And you can see the tagline is talking about me having expertise on the, on Nicobaris, and then there is this major disaster that takes place in 2004, the tsunami, the Indian Ocean tsunami. And I was a researcher doing my doctoral studies, writing, kind of studying these islands for over years. And then suddenly I had to make a decision, should I continue with my research or have to help these islanders in this very critical moment after this catastrophe, which was really a major, like a major event worldwide. So that's how the title comes from, and then how this leads me to create a whole research program, and that's what I will also talk about today. So I'll take you back in April 1999, and I was sailing to these islands, as you can see, on the map. They are around 1,200 kilometers east of the Indian coast, and quite remote, like quite far from India mainland, but they are close to Sumatra, and so that's where they're located. So I had made an important decision at that time to live and study these islanders, and it takes a long time to get there. There's no regular shipping. It's also a protected area, so basically to protect indigenous people. But India also has a very strong, defense base, so that's a second reason. And so you need very special permission to go to these islands. Almost impossible to get those permission, unfortunately. So, which in a way meant also that these islands have been protected for a long time. Now, more recently, they're discussing opening up some areas, but I'm talking about a time where it was pretty isolated, which it still is in many ways. And I was fortunate to get a Government of India grant and some support to document the Nicobaris. So when I arrived there, I mean, you take several ways to get there. It takes quite a long time to get, to the islands. And then you arrive and you see these very spectacular images. There's the Nicobaris living along the coast and, behind mangroves. And this is a picture of a typical village, which is at the coast. And you can see that, all the materials are local and, made from thatched. There's all these, thatched roofs, and they live on stilts. So they have, because of heavy monsoons and a lot of reptiles, so it is safer to be on stilts. This is very, very typical of a tropical architecture. And you will also see that the Nicobaris don't quite look like mainland Indians. They are more Southeast Asian in their in the culture as well, and they had migrated more than 2,000 years ago from the Malay Burma coast, over time to the Nicobar. So, and the language they speak also is more closer to Southeast Asian. They call them the Mont Khmer, the Austroasiatic group of languages. So, but because they have been so isolated for over 2,000 years, the languages are quite kind of distinct than what's spoken in Southeast Asia, but the roots are similar. So what do they do for a living? See, as hunter and gatherers, from the forest, fishing as a coastal community, raising pigs. So pigs are an important, you can say, resource capital. So pigs eating a lot of coconuts, and this is their wealth. So the more the pigs, the more wealth you have. And yeah, and a lot of fishing activities. They fetch coconuts. So it's a coconut economy. So they rely on coconuts, like really all parts of the coconut are used, whether from you drink the coconut water or use the meat or even the husk and the shells and for so it's extremely important, or even to feed the pigs. So you see that they fetch coconuts. A large amount of coconuts go into copra production, which is so what you do in copra production is it's actually dehydrated coconut. So you remove the shells, the husk. As you can see, this group, this family engaging in this activity, and then this white coconut meat would be baked over fire for almost 2 days, and so it would be dry. So what you would have at the end is this dry coconut meat, and that's called copra, and that is then traded. So well, it's actually a barter trade. So they use canoes, and that's the main way to transport themselves, because when inside the island is very dense to tropical, so it's difficult to navigate through the dense forest. So most of the mobility is along the coast, and they're using boats. And this is a typical canoe that they use. So they would bring their copra to a neighboring island where there is a government headquarters. So there are points in the archipelago where they have Indian government administration. And so just around that would be a small settlement for people who have small shops and also like do kind of contract or wage labor for some government activities. And so they would bring this copra here and there would be barter trade. So Nicobaris never used cash. They never had bank accounts. They didn't know what to do with currency. Everything was barter. Basically, a few things they needed from the market. And so they would give their copra and they would get some rice and sugar, cloth, kerosene. And but for the most part, it is very, kind of subsistence. So they are using their own natural resources for most of the living. So animistic tradition. So animism means they are worshipping, or they are, they appease the spirits of the dead, of the ancestors, and the spirits of nature, of the sea, and of nature. Um, and so they have very elaborate rituals, and I won't go into that today. But there are a lot of elaborate rituals. Some last for a whole year, and they would invoke these deities. So what you see here is a statue, a wooden, kind of a figure of humans. And what's inside there, like the one in front, the one that is kind of you can say a sitting karyav, so they're called karyavs. This has the bones of a shaman. So when a known shaman dies, has known to have, special powers to communicate with the spirits, and then when the shaman dies, they take the bones and they kind of bury it in these statues. So, and during crisis, when there is disaster crisis, they invoke, or even also during festivities. So when there is festivals, they would invoke them for and appease them for blessings and for their protection. So you can say this is their form of disaster management, and keeping relationships with nature and with the spirits, with the ancestors. And they understand, and they did not go to any sustainability degree, or any university, but they know that if they overuse their resources, or if they do not live, in tune with the environment, they will face themselves as extinct, so they know that their own survival, own continued livelihoods depend on the well-being of the environment around them. So they have very elaborate relations with how they do that. There's a lot of festivals, so I won't go into that. I've written quite a bit about it, but just tell you a little bit about their culture and their like spiritual practices. So these islands faced, unfortunately, the world's deadly tsunami, and one of the most devastating catastrophes for a long time that we know. We can say a very spectacular event, because many people didn't even know about the tsunami until this time. So, and so when the news came about tsunami, many people didn't know what it was. um, and um, and 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 more than 200,000 people died. Many countries were affected. It happened around the holiday season during Christmas time, where many people from all over the world were actually vacationing in Thailand and Sri Lanka, and so nearly everybody knew on this planet somebody who was affected, who was there, or they knew they had friends of friends who were there and were stuck. So it was an event that really affected the entire world. So it was a big shock. It was headlines for a long time, and the death rates were very high, and the damages were very, very high, and a lot of money was raised. It was one of the world's largest fundraising exercises. So more than $14 billion were raised and pledged for the victims. So imagine this is a major catastrophe, globally, world news. And then in this right close to the epicenter are these group of islands, which are not known. People can't go there. We know very little about them. And these are indigenous people, and these islands are washed from one end to the other. So imagine 20-meter high waves coming from one end to the other and washing the islands. So a third of the population died on the Nicobar, so they're the closest to the epicenter, and they lost everything. And so, but very little information, and we don't know how to help them. I was in India. I was on the way to the Nicobars at this time, and I had to pause my journey and find a way to get there because there was no way to get to the Nicobars like at that time. But but 3 weeks later, I was able to get there. And so when I arrived, I saw huge devastation, like everything had changed, things had transformed. Villages didn't exist as they did. The people I knew didn't live anymore. And came a wave of aid. So there's, and so I also call it a second tsunami. So of course there was the physical destruction, loss of lives, of livelihoods, of infrastructure, um, but but then there came a second tsunami over the next few months that is a lot of aid. So you see that Nicobaris who were living very simply from coconuts and pig and fish, suddenly they became millionaires overnight. They got so much cash and they got so much aid in terms of like electronics or food or so I want to show you some images like it was a transformation. Suddenly people had junk food, they had electronics, they could buy televisions, mobile phones. And so as per the Indian government policy, there was every victim gets a lot of money. So, and I mentioned they didn't have money before. So they had to open bank accounts and they never knew how to do that. So they had a passbook, and with that passbook, they could go and just buy about anything because they were millionaires. And it was a time where traders could really sell whatever at whatever price. So, and TV, when TV comes into the culture, they watch Bollywood films and they were able to see the commercials, and the commercials told them what they don't have. And so you see, from a very self-reliant subsistence society, they're suddenly exposed to things that they never heard of and they never had, and now they wanted it. Um, and they could have it because they had the money. So there was a huge market there. So I saw this very tragic situation, of course, and I spent many years after the tsunami in this process. So I want to show you, because I was looking at the resource use patterns, and interestingly, I had documented about the metabolic profiles, and I'll talk more about metabolism later as part of my research program. But the whole idea is that we were looking at in my early years, so when I put 2000, soon after I arrived, I was quantifying the resource use patterns of this Nicobarese. So you could see that this is very unusual. The circle is a system boundaries. Let's say it's the island boundary, and they needed very little from outside. So very little, like I told you, a little bit of rice and sugar and cloth, but most of it, their needs were met by local, they were met locally. So you could see the energy sources and all the material sources were coming from within that circle. That means within the domestic environment that was locally. And you can see that was there. But then uh, apart from trying to be useful after the tsunami, I was also quantifying and measuring. And you can see this island system transformed from a self-reliant, very localized community to a very import-dependent system. So everything was coming from outside. And they were interested in all the things they never had before. So electronics and fossil fuels and everything came. So you can see it's a huge transition. And so when there is a change in the biophysical system, this affects the social system as well. So when consumerism increases, when you have a different resource regime, so there's different terms. There is It also affects your society, how you organize these resources, how you interact with each other. People want more, and conflicts come in. So I want to show you here just a few things about the transformations that happened socially. So and that was triggered by this whole change in the resource system. So a good leader became somebody who could actually negotiate with the outside world, with NGOs, with government to get more aid, to get more money. So before, the good leader was somebody who knew the local, history, and who owns what, and they had the ability to resolve conflicts. So they had different, let's say, knowledge system, and suddenly they needed new forms of knowledge. So a leader who could not speak Hindi or could not communicate to the outside or negotiate for more resources or more aid wasn't a good leader anymore. So you had a new type of leadership. They were called tsunami captains, means leaders who who grew out of the tsunami crisis. And so and then there was a lot of corruption that came into the system because everybody wanted more than the neighbors. There was competition. So social stratification was on the rise. Some people had more, some had less. So before, we had a pretty much equal society, and suddenly there was haves and have-nots, and they were in conflict. The family system also disintegrated. Nicobaris originally lived in large joint families, so around 40 people, several nuclear families living together, several generations. But then the aid that was delivered was mainly individual to nuclear families. So the aid was not given to joint families, it was to nuclear, so husband, wife, and children. So imagine if I am a nuclear family, I would get the aid. What's the advantage of me staying with a large family? So because everything, even houses, were given to the homes that were built, from outside material, were given to nuclear family. They were not made large enough for joint families. So you saw a disintegration of the family system and the common pool resources of the, because the forest and the ocean, the coast were owned or had rights as a joint family, not as a nuclear family. So a lot of conflicts. Values were in conflict. Um, to modernize, to develop or not. So, young people wanted more freedom. They wanted, in a way, like more modern, like electronics, and they were more interested in cell phones and junk food. And then the elders didn't want that. They were worried about this change. They were concerned. So there were conflicts of values here. And so it was a system that was in total upheaval. So I experienced that very, very closely for several years. And so the New Scientist was writing again this with this. I watched a flood of aid destroy a culture, and so I lived this story for more than 10 years, 15 years. So before tsunami, after tsunami, so I was able to document very closely these changes. And if you're interested to learn more about this, there is a documentary called Aftermath, the Second Flood. And so University of Waterloo has a DVD. Um, so this, yeah, was filmed over many, many years. And so it's a real-time documentary which captures a lot of the situation and the problem of aid. So the questions it asks, this film, why is aid so unsustainable? Why is, what is good help? So we want to help. I'm not saying the NGOs or people were trying to destroy them, but many organizations, I mean, they're well-meaning people when I talk to them, but how come, aid becomes so unsustainable? And so what would be good help? How could we help people in crisis? And what's the role of science in there? Because of my own position as a researcher as well. So this was also a part of the film. So um, and so that was the film was released, and it's been shown worldwide in different settings, in different film festivals, at conferences, because it raises a very important con- debate about the role of science and about what is good health. And when the film was released, Nature also did a film review uh, in a very positive way, saying AIDS inconvenient truth. So that also promoted the film quite a bit because they compared this film to another very famous film that was there before called "The Gods Must Be Crazy." This happened in Africa. So this film also got a lot of traction because of that. Um, so now I want to move from my dilemma, which I went through for over a decade, that actually quite a long journey, how this led to the founding of a research program, or why islands matter. And so soon, so around that time, I then started a whole research program called Metabolism of Islands. And I know some of you are global health or health practitioners, so you know what metabolism is. And I'm using this as an analogy. But the idea was that to say, because at that time, I looked at one disaster, but islands in the last few years started to face even more and more disasters. The frequency of disasters that islands are facing just grew like crazy. Intensity and frequency, and not because of an earthquake that triggered the tsunami, but because of climate change. So disasters were more in the path of the islands or vice versa. And so this was a matter of concern because there were a lot of money was still coming from outside and trying to rebuild and build back better and all those ideas of resilience. And that triggered this whole experience from the tsunami and from Nicobar I said, well, this was a huge motivation for me to build a whole program around islands. And so initially, of course, work like that is not seen, like, okay, what's wrong with islands and why should we really care about islands? There are not so many people living there. And, I mean, and it's happening out there anyway. Now we know that we may not have mangoes. And now we know that leaf falls happening a month before, or now we know how Europe is warmer so quickly. And, like now we know about fires. Everything is happening in our backyards. Now it's not out there anymore. It's happening right in our backyards. So this work has become quite relevant over the years, but you can imagine that initially when I was talking about these things, it was difficult to get the message because islands were far remote, not enough people to worry about, and if something happened every now and then, I mean, that wasn't the big news. So, but today it is very different. There's a lot of focus, a lot of attention on islands. And so I've been studying island sustainability, as you probably saw from the early years, for a long time. In fact, from already as a student, so I was a grad student, and it shaped my thinking, my thesis work, my early career, my later career. And I've been looking at islands from a social metabolic perspective. And I use the term, basically it's an analogy, say islands as an organism analogy. So saying that islands function like living organism. And what he's saying is that what it means is that they depend on metabolic flow, just like human bodies. We depend on materials and energy, water. We consume those and then we produce waste. So just like this cow here has a metabolic process, grazing, and water, air, and then there is milk and there is some waste. And so you can look at an island, but any socio-economic system would go through the same pattern. So these resources, islands would import or they would extract domestically, and then you would have exports and waste. And so we call them flows, the metabolic flows, because so I'm going to use a language of stocks and flows. So the flows are things that, that enter into the system, you consume like food, and then there is within a short time, there are outflows. So from inflows to outflows. But then as, but also like human bodies, we are also building stocks. We are also growing, we are also building blocks so we are growing, our up to a certain point, our size is increasing as bodies. But in socioeconomic systems, size can grow to very unsustainable levels. And so we call them stocks. And stocks means basically infrastructure. So when you're building a university or a hospital or roads or, any home, houses, so these are we building stocks. And there's an interesting kind of dynamic between stock and flow, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute. So basically, for those who don't understand metabolism, it's basically there's an input, there's a put, and there's an output. So it is the way I explain social metabolism or idea of the metabolic approach to socioeconomic systems. Now, the problem is the put. So I will talk about that also later. So let's see that globally we extract a certain number of resources, 100 billion tons, if I remember correctly. And out of the total global extraction that we have in a year, 75% is either used to create new stocks or maintain the old stocks and repair and maintain and to operate the stocks. So you can see 75% of every year that we extract is going into creating new buildings and new material or maintaining, repairing, or operating them, with energy, and water. And so, but this wasn't the case. Like in 1900, 100 years ago, it was only 20% of the global extraction that went into making new infrastructure. And now it has more than doubled. So the question is, how did that happen? So I'll show you an example from Mali. Mali is one of the island nations that I do research on. So as economies develop, and it is a typical pattern, they stimulate the demand for essential services. So let's say an island economy becomes, rich because of tourism, or, the more wealth you have, it doesn't have to be islands, could be any economy, even from, let's say, India or any countries that make wealth because either oil or any kind of economic growth. Um, then they want better roads, they want better airports, they want better health services, they want better hospitals. So you need better services, right? So and that we call put, so that's the unit that is more put. But these services are delivered by stocks. You need to, in order to have better transport service, you need to build a road. In order to have better healthcare services, you need to build better hospitals, bigger hospitals with more facilities. So you can only deliver those critical services of housing, energy, food by building infrastructure. And this infrastructure requires flows. So you need materials that can actually build first and then maintain them and operate them. So look at Mali in over 50 years. So Mali, and this is the capital of Maldives. 950, you saw the forest cover. Infrastructure was very little along the coast, very small settlement. But now the entire island is urban. So I was talking to my colleagues recently, and I said, okay, where could, like, I would like, my team is coming, and if they want to stay, could we be a little outside the city? They're saying, no, this whole island is urban. There is no countryside here. You have to go to another island. So you can see that it's totally. Now, just imagine if you have an infrastructure like this or a put like that, that stocks, which system needs more flows? Obviously, the one on the right. You need more flows because the more stocks you have, the more flows you need to maintain and operate them. So, so there is an interesting dynamic called the stock flow service nexus, and it's a feedback system. It's a reinforcing loop. The more the need for services, the more the flows you need to, to create, to build more stocks. More stocks give more services then, generate revenue, and they need more flows to build more stocks. So this is a feedback system which is reinforcing. And so over time, patterns of resources can become unsustainable. You just imagine our human bodies, we get wealth and we want to eat all the junk food, go to restaurants and stop eating the healthy stuff at home. But we want to eat fast food. We just tend to order more food, and it's just so easy, you can do that. So because we have the money. And this change in diets has happened in many parts of the world. In India, diets have changed enormously. Like when, like now, and there's a big issue in India with health. Like they're trying to ban certain types of sales in schools and so on because their health the problems they didn't have, they're starting to have. So, and so similarly, in a socioeconomic system, when you start to have this interesting reinforcing loop, the more put system, which is not thought sustainably, like how do we actually maintain that? And we just grow and grow and grow. And maybe that growth that doesn't really translate into human well-being, and so that is again questionable. So what we are doing is we are creating metabolic risk, just like in a body. If you're eating unhealthy food over time, if you know, went to Neil and Neil would look at your blood test and he say, well, my friend, I think there's a problem here. In 10 years, you have higher chance of a heart attack. Or your cholesterol levels are going towards risk levels, so you got to take some action here. So you are accumulating future risk in your body and in the socioeconomic system as well. So you have options. Your option is to change your lifestyle to like modify your metabolism, different pathways of metabolism, become like healthier and more exercise, or you could prescribe pills and say, okay, well, since you don't want to do that, you might as well start taking medicines now because, in 10 years you'll be at great risk. So you would say, well, I'm not going to leave my lifestyle. I like my whatever food, junk food, and medicines. I don't care. Then you must be prepared for a shock in the future, like surprises. Surprises. Suddenly you might have health issues and systems surprise us, and so you have options, and you have different alternatives to act on. But if you don't, then you'll be prepared. So I use the same idea to talk about the metabolic risk on islands, and policymakers now understand it when I explain it in this way. And I do my homework before I talk to them. So I show patterns of resource use. So what I'm doing here, I just told you, is so these risks, these social metabolic risks are to islands as circulatory health problems are to humans. You know, both constrain the entity's ability to withstand significant shocks and changes. So if our metabolism is weak and we are weak, then we are more likely to fall sick. We are more likely to get disease, certain type of health issues in the future. We are more vulnerable. So similarly, just like human bodies, that if with accumulating metabolic risk, even island systems are more vulnerable to future shocks of climate, for from whether it's from disasters and so on. So and when islands are on the path to some maladaptive and climate insensitive development practices, which we find now in our studies, like coastal squeeze, building everything along the coast, or, kind of putting everything into tourism and then importing all your critical needs from outside, you know. So most islands import most of their food from outside. So, and when you have centralized energy systems, so when you start to have this maladaptive development or let's say metabolic regime on the islands, you're magnifying the island's climate vulnerability. So, and this vulnerability can be exposed to these weaknesses, these vulnerable systems can be exposed to extreme events. Could be wars, could be pandemics, could be disasters, climate impacts. So, and then suddenly there is a huge shock to deal with. So I want to show you just heuristically that over time, just imagine Mali, over time in 1950, how it grew stocks and certain type of development. And do you believe that all this one island with urban, like huge urban, like it's a whole urban island, that it is only for the population of like local population, they're only from Maldives? No, it's for outsiders, for tourists. Local people don't need that much urban, urbanization. So we are not thinking enough about these things, and then comes a kind of a collapse. So this is just to show visualizing how a metabolic risk can be accumulated in a system, and then comes a tipping point. So what I do in my work, I have this program called Metabolism of Islands, as I mentioned, and we monitor economy-wide resource use. So we quantify all those from entry to exit. We look at how the system is accumulating metabolic risk over time, and space as well. We also look at environmental justice issues, because when you see a certain metabolism in a socioeconomic system, this is um, this is um, not benefiting everybody equally. Let's say an economy was growing, but it's only benefiting certain social groups, that growth. But many people are living in poverty, and they're paying the price for that growth in economy. So just because your GDP is growing in a country doesn't mean everybody is doing good, you know. So there is an inequality issue here. And so what we analyze is the cost and benefit of social metabolism. Who's benefiting from a social metabolic structure, uh, and who's paying the price for it? Which are the social groups who actually live in dangerous situations, like near landfills and coastal areas where there is like polluted water, where there's mining, and which are the groups who live in very rich neighborhoods and gets all the benefit? So we look at it also from that perspective. And what you're doing here, you might ask, how is that to do with risk? To understand environmental justice or social justice, it has to do with risk, because you're creating social risk. And social risk means that when there are more inequalities in the system, these becomes hotspots of conflict. When people feel the inequalities, then you can, there's more crime, more conflicts, more resistance movements. People resist. Even if it's passive, they may not be active, but passive resistance happens. So these are hotspots of conflict. So you need to build your walls higher. You need to have guards and dogs to save your wealth. So rich neighborhoods, have you seen the rich neighborhoods? They have guards, and they have to put dogs, and they need more safety, because of high risk, because somebody can come steal their wealth. So this is a risk issue. So that's how we link it to the social kind of metabolic system. We look at how close a system is to collapse as well. And we look for strategies how island metabolism can move from more linear to a circular metabolism and become more resource efficient, more adaptive, more resilient. So we are looking for solutions as well, to advise. And how can islands achieve a high quality of life with the lowest environmental impact? So that's one of our goals. So these are things we do in our team, and so Grenada, I'll give you a couple of examples, and then we can chat. So Grenada is one island we analyzed very early on, and so I'm going to show you that this is a map. You see this. This is the geospatial um, map of Grenada, and the red parts you see are where hotspots of stocks. Like these are the high level of concentration of material stocks of infrastructure. So you can see most of the infrastructure and therefore services, even that really service, are concentrated in only one part of the island, which is southwest. Now, this is not a very good place in the Firstly, coastal squeeze is never good, but to have it, this is on the path of hurricanes. So when hurricanes come, imagine how much of the loss of services, apart from loss of infrastructure. So we looked up. So when we showed this map, to policymakers, and we said that, and so that we show that this is a kind of situation, and let's look at what happens, what if, and so what are you going to be most affected by, so we looked at some of those scenarios, like 1 meter sea level rise, and said, okay, with just 1 meter sea level rise, what what's the impact? So we said tourism, which is again along the coast, right? Even though it is not the largest of the economy, but this is the most hit sector, and then the industry. So you can put those together. Basically, the whole economy is down. So and then comes the other ones and so on. So this type of this type of analysis um, makes them think whether it is indeed wise to have things along, on the coast and so on. And so we were also looking at the Bahamas, where we looked at a similar situation as a 1 meter sea level rise, and we saw that the northern part of the country would be most impacted. And so, um, you know, uh, so large part of their transport infrastructure would be impacted. And imagine for islands, seaports are so important, like their oil comes with that, and so if you disrupt their transport, then you disrupt the supply chains. They're isolated. So with 1 meter sea level rise, and you can be impacted. But the Bahamas in 2018, I think they had this Hurricane Dorian, and this Dorian hurricane, they destroyed their ports, and the ports had also reserves for oil. So imagine with with if you have on the coast this type of, if you're going to rely on oil from outside, you got to, of course, it's going to go via ship. You're going to store it along the coast somewhere. Then comes hurricane, and this reserve was destroyed. So oil spill happened. Bahamas was surrounded by oil spill, and they're still cleaning up. It's a huge loss for a lot of money to clean up and a lot of damage to the marine ecosystem, to tourism. So we were talking about these metabolic risks, to the whole metabolism. So that disrupts the whole system. Um, and so, like the food security, the Caribbean imports 83% of their food from outside in kind of monetary terms. And so, but it was not the case always. Up until the 1970s, Caribbean was a net exporter of food. It used to export. And now what you see this line, when you see a zero in the middle here, this is the physical trade balance. What is below the zero is that means they had food surplus. And from the 1970s, you see a food deficit. So that is the import. So what you're seeing, the whole yellow on the top and the blue on top, these countries, they are importing food from outside. So you can imagine that what happens when you are importing most of your food from outside. And to give you an example of this imported food, when they come over long distances, they have they lack nutrients because they are frozen, they are packaged, they are processed. You cannot get fresh produce from long distances, so they have to be. So by the time they arrive, and a lot of junk food arrives on these islands, and so there's a lot of deficiency, like micronutrient deficiencies in the Caribbean, one of the highest in the world. So I will probably won't read all of that, but you can get the point that that they're highly kind of deficient in micronutrients. On the other hand, while they were highly deficient in what they shouldn't be in, they exceed the maximum recommended daily allowance for sweets and fats. So all the stuff that they shouldn't have, they have excess of that because of the processed food. So now what happened during the pandemic, and this is a survey I'll show you, is that because of the supply chains were destroyed, because there was this lack of supply, there was a huge impact on their food system. So I'll give you just one example about people self-reporting. So almost 40% of the people said they were hungry but did not eat in the Caribbean. This was a survey done with over 20,000 people. And so then more than 40% said my household ran out of food. And then more than 60% people said I was unable to eat healthy and nutritious food. You can imagine the impact of a pandemic over the years. So these colors show different periods of time when the survey was taken in 2021, 2022, and then later in 2022 again. So you see how in such a short time, an event like the pandemic actually impacted their food system. And this impacts their well-being, their health, and that impacts the economy as well. So you can look at cascades to the whole system. So waste flows on Grenada. So we also look at outflows, not only inflows. So you can say in Grenada, you can see Now, just a simple message is that things are coming, it's a linear system coming into the island, you know. A lot of things are imported. They're coming into the system, and then there is this huge waste of 50,000 tons of waste per year, and nearly all of it stays on the island. So it's a linear system, things coming from outside, including packaging material, plastic, glass, you know, like plastic bottles, coming from outside. It's and with the lack of proper waste management system, you know, and exporting waste is very expensive, so it stays on the island. And landfills are not very well managed because of needs a lot of economic resources to maintain waste, to manage waste. So you see a lot of bad waste management practices on islands because of lack of resources. And oftentimes they're at the coast. So when rain comes, you know, they leach all the harmful toxic stuff to the oceans, and so you pollute the soils and so. So then it creates a new cascade of other problems, you see. And waste is higher because of tourism as well, you know, because people come and they consume. So, you know, and so they have a higher than average, world average waste generation per capita. See? But very little is recycled because of, again, the facilities and the infrastructure and the economic resources to recycle, to repurpose. So this example for Bahamas, you'll see that recycling is less than 1%. And this is our studies from many islands. We can say recycling is pretty much less than 1% on islands. The world average is around 8, 9%, the global average of recycling rates, which is not great either, but it is like almost 10 times higher than islands. So we have too much put, right? And and so I talk a lot about in my research about put. So I didn't go into a lot of details in put here, but just to give you a glimpse that we know that output is a function of input. We say, okay, you know, we understand input output more commonly, but I try to argue that input is a function of put. Because think about the Mali example. If you increase the put, input increases automatically, you see. So we pay so much attention on input, what comes in, and we pay so much attention on output. Okay, let's recycle, repurpose, you know, but we don't think about the put because the put is what determines the input and the output. So that is that's why I say we need a put policy, you know, and 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 I won't go again into all the details, but I want to end now this talk with say, do islands matter and what can we learn? Like, do we really need to care about them? I think we should care and we can learn a lot, and they do matter. Firstly, it's an environmental justice question. They are the least responsible for climate impacts. Collectively, island nations contribute to less than 1% of greenhouse gas emissions, right? But they're the most impacted. So they have an existential crisis. We have almost 10% of the world's population living on islands. And 1 in 4 countries in the UN are islands or archipelagos. So 25%, that's a big number, right? So they do matter. If you look at the marine and the economic zones and you know how much, because islands are not only island like land, but islands also have the ocean around them, the economic zone, and so we can call them small island states, but we can also call them large ocean states because many islands have huge ocean areas that they control, like it's part of the territory. So if you count all of those ocean areas, they rely, or that basically they are 1/6 of the Earth's total area, which is huge, right? I learned recently that Seychelles is an archipelago in the Indian Ocean. It has an ocean area of 1.35 million square kilometers, which is the second largest ocean area uh, owned by a country after Norway. So even though they're islands, small islands, but the ocean area they control is huge. So islands are hotspots of biodiversity hotspots as well, and they have 20% of all plant, bird, reptile species, so very rich because many of the islands are in tropical areas. And but because they're resource constrained, and we talked about the risks now, they are facing an existentialist crisis. But at the same time, this urgency on islands is also an opportunity for us to innovate. to learn about how we can become more resilient. Because when there is urgency, when there is a need and urgency situation, we become very creative, we become very innovative. And so islands can provide us with a lot of insight on how we can uh, uh, transition to a more sustainable world. It can be helpful insights for all of us. So in case you're planning your next beach holiday, and the holidays season is approaching, so please take some of our publications and enjoy them at the beach. So thank you very much, and I will stop here.